He laughed. That kind of laugh that isn't just sound, it's a message. A warning shot wrapped in arrogance. Trump didn't just toss out words. He threw them, sat back like a man who thought he owned the moment. Like the chamber, the cameras, the country were all stitched into the lining of his suit. The insult rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. She's low IQ. I've met plenty. But this one? And then that smile, the kind you see on someone who's never been told no in his entire life. The kind of smile that says, you won't fight back. You don't belong here. I've already won. And for half a second, the air didn't move. Even the lights felt colder. The room wasn't stunned because they'd never heard something like that before. It was stunned because he said it like it meant nothing. Like degrading a woman, a black congresswoman, in a congressional hearing was just another bullet point on his to-do list. Reporters shifted in their seats. Aides glanced at one another. Jim Jordan smirked. Marjorie Taylor Greene scribbled something in her notebook that looked more like gloating than notes. And across the room, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Not a blink. Not a twitch. She sat there like a loaded weapon that had just decided not to fire yet. Trump thought he'd silenced her, thought he'd embarrassed her. But what he didn't know, what no one in that chamber could possibly see coming, was that the real weapon wasn't her words. It was what was sitting right in front of Herselin, sealed and waiting. A plain envelope, one that didn't raise its voice, one that didn't need to. Because while Trump laughed, Jasmine stared. Not with fear, not with fury, but with precision. Because she knew something he didn't. She wasn't here to play defense. She was here to detonate. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Not a blink. Not a flinch. Nothing. And that kind of stillness? That unnerves men like him, the loud ones, the smug ones, the ones who rely on shock to win rooms they don't deserve. She just sat there, like gravity answered to her. Not defiant, not shaken, but calm in a way that made the insult echo longer than it should have. She didn't reach for the mic. She didn't fumble her notes. She didn't even shift in her seat. She just locked eyes, or maybe didn't because even that would have been too generous. In front of her, resting quietly on polished wood, was a folder, slim, neat, nothing flashy, but inside it, an envelope, white, tucked in like a secret that hadn't been spoken in decades. No stamp, no label, no panic, just presence. It didn't scream for attention. It whispered like thunder held back behind glass. That envelope wasn't paper, it was pressure, silent weight, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just sits there, daring someone to test it. And Trump had. Oh, he had. He'd pointed his finger, flung his insult like a dart soaked in ego, and laughed like he thought history would applaud him for it. But Jasmine knew better. She knew that the most dangerous thing in that room wasn't at the podium yelling. It was under her hand. Quiet. Still. Ready. And as the insult hung in the air like a foul mist, Jasmine just sate very inch of her, saying without saying, "You have no idea what I'm holding. You just opened a door you can't close. Keep talking." Because the moment that envelope opened, the world wasn't going to laugh with him anymore. They were going to listen to her. Trump, thinking he'd already claimed the moment, kept talking. His voice didn't just fill the room, it pushed at it, swelled in it, tried to dominate it like a wave that didn't care who it drowned. He gestured with his hands, leaned into the microphone like it owed him something, as if the podium itself had to bend under the weight of his confidence. Every word he dropped felt like it was begging for laughter, for nods, for that performative echo chamber applause he was so used to getting. And when none came, he didn't notice. Because men like Trump rarely listen for silence, they just assume it's admiration. He paced his voice like a man who thinks he's holding court, like every sentence is history being made, instead of ego being poured through a broken funnel. He joked about IQ again. Spun half-facts into grins, tossed backhanded swipes dressed up as bravado, and through it all, Jasmine didn't give him what he wanted. Not a word, not a glance, not even a breath too loud. She sat there like she wasn't in the same room, but somehow, still in control of all of it. What Trump mistook for weakness was something else entirely. Jasmine's silence wasn't retreat. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hesitation. It was something far more dangerous to a man like him. It was strategy. Because silence, when used right, doesn't shrink. It expands. It takes up oxygen. It makes the lights feel hotter. It makes the air feel thin. And in that hearing room, every second she didn't speak made the room feel tighter, like someone was slowly winding the tension around every spine, every wrist, every chest. Jasmine wasn't reacting because she didn't need to. She had already set the tempo. And Trump? He was dancing to a rhythm he didn't know she was playing. His words grew louder, more forced, more performative. The desperation crept in slowly, the kind no one else in his circle could see yet. But Jasmine did. She felt it, because she knew what was coming. He didn't. That was the difference. He thought his volume could bend truth. But truth, when it waits silently in an envelope, doesn't bend. It snaps. And Jasmine was just letting him talk long enough to hang himself with his own echo. Behind her eyes, calculation. Not rage as she'd burned through that years ago. Not shock this wasn't new. She'd seen men like him her whole life. Men who measured intelligence by how loud they could speak over others. Men who thought a woman's silence was a sign of defeat, not design. No. What lived behind Jasmine's stare in that moment wasn't emotion, it was rhythm. Precise, steady, timed like a heartbeat under pressure. Like a clock counting down towards something no one else in the room had noticed yet. She wasn't just sitting still, she was sinking. With what? Not the noise, not the cameras, but with herself, with something deeper. Her pulse, her breath, the weight of what she was about to release. Every insult he threw at her didn't land, it ricocheted and collected into a tighter, sharper point behind her eyes. Like she was letting them stack, not because they hurt, but because she knew that when she answered, it would be once, and it would be final. Trump was flailing with words, reaching for dominance through sound. But Jasmine? Jasmine was tuning out the show and locking in on the silence. Because inside that silence was the truth. Inside that stillness was a plan she'd been perfecting long before this hearing ever started. She wasn't improvising. She was waiting, not for her turn to speak, for the exact moment when speaking would matter most. Every second, she breathed in to stay calm, but to stay sharp. Every blink she didn't take, every movement she resisted, was part of a rhythm only she understood. The envelope on the table wasn't just paper, it was a drumbeat, a fuse. And Jasmine? She was the match. Sitting there with her fire wrapped in calm, timing her next move, like a surgeon timing a cut, because when she did move, it wouldn't just shift the room. It would tear it wide open. Jim Jordan smirked the way men do when they think the damage has been done. The kind of smirk that doesn't come from courage, but from proximity to power. He looked at Trump like a proud spectator watching his champion land the blow. Marjorie Taylor Greene leaned in, scribbling something fast and gleeful in thick ink across her yellow pad, maybe a soundbite, maybe a punchline for her next Fox appearance. She looked like she was enjoying herself too much, like the whole thing was entertainment, not testimony. Eric Trump, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair with that adolescent grin, as if he just watched his dad push over a chessboard he never learned to play. The boys in the room all thought the game had ended. The punchline had been delivered. Jasmine had been quiet too long. But none of them noticed her hand. Not the cameras, not the pundits, not even the people watching at home yet. While their eyes danced with smug approval, Jasmine's hand remained steady. Her fingers didn't twitch. Her arm didn't shift. But her index finger, just that one, rested lightly on the top of the envelope in front of her. The gesture was so small, so effortless, so dismissible. And that's why it mattered. Because while the room celebrated what they thought was her silence, Jasmine had already made her move. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, but a real one. That envelope had been sitting there for minutes, untouched, quiet. And now it was a live wire beneath her fingertip. She wasn't opening it yet. She wasn't rushing. She was letting it ache in the light, letting it sweat under the cameras, letting it pulse with the weight of everything it held. Because she knew exactly what was inside. And more importantly, she knew exactly what it would do when it came out. To them, it was just paper. To her, it was the pivot point of the entire hearing. She was letting them get comfortable, letting them laugh, letting them believe they'd won the room. Because Jasmine understood something they never would. You don't need to raise your voice when the truth is sitting in front of you, loaded and waiting. Her finger didn't press down. It didn't slide the envelope forward. It just rested, like she was holding back something that wanted to rise too soon. Like she was holding the lid on a box that, once opened, couldn't be closed again. They were still playing politics. She was preparing proof. And while they celebrated their own noise, they didn't even see it. The beginning of the end was already beneath her hand. The truth doesn't need to knock. It waits, quietly, until the moment comes. And Jasmine Crockett was the only one in the room who knew that moment was almost here. Trump mocked degrees like they were punchlines, mocked intelligence like it was something he could define by who clapped the loudest. His voice carried the same way it always did, thick with bravado, bloated with certainty. I've taken the hardest IQ tests. Passed them all. Ask anybody, he said, grinning like he'd just dropped a truth bomb. Like the words themselves were enough to convince the room that he was brilliant, elite, untouchable. It wasn't a statement, it was a performance. He said it the way a man does when he believes repetition makes something real. The chamber shifted, not physically, but in feeling. The air thickened. His voice slithered across the room like smoke from a cigar no one wanted lit. Every syllable was coded in the assumption that if he sounded confident enough, no one would dare ask for receipts. His face was lit up with that old showman energy, like he was back on a stage with a crowd that adored the myth of him. He smiled at the cameras, not because he had anything new to offer, but because he thought the idea of him was enough, the idea of a genius, the idea of someone who wins even when he cheats. The idea of a man who never had to explain himself because he'd already rewritten the rules. But Jasmine wasn't watching the show. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't reacting. She wasn't even blinking, because she'd seen this tactic before. She'd grown up around men who boomed their voices to mask what they lacked. She knew the playbook. Bury the truth under swagger, wrap ego in fake credentials, and pretend your confidence is qualification. She'd watched men like him choke the room with arrogance and call it leadership. But Jasmine also knew something Trump didn't. Smoke doesn't last. It fills a room quick. It blinds people. It makes them cough. But then eventually it clears. And when it does, all that's left is the mess it was hiding. Trump's words were smoke, all of them. The tests, the scores, the self-praise. They were fog, noise. Manufactured fog designed to stall, to distract, to keep the room from noticing the sealed envelope sitting just inches away from Jasmine's still, steady hand. The difference between them was simple. He had noise. She had proof. He had performance. She had paper. Real names, real dates, real damage. And while he puffed up his chest and repeated the same hollow lines, Jasmine didn't need to say a word. Because once the smoke cleared and it, would everyone in that room, and everyone watching beyond it, would see what she'd been holding the whole time. They'd see what he had spent decades trying to bury under applause and spin. And in that moment, they'd realize he wasn't smart. He was terrified of the one woman in the room who didn't need to shout to tear down the entire lie he built. Then he said it. Loud, smug, final like he was tossing down a royal flush when the rest of the table hadn't even been dealt in yet. His voice rose just enough to slice through the stillness like a cheap trick in a magic act gone stale. Let's settle this with an IQ test. Right here, right now. And for a beat, maybe two, the room didn't breathe. It froze. Not because it was shocked by the challenge, but because of who he was saying it to. Because everyone in that chamber, Republicans, Democrats, press, even the camera operators knew Jasmine Crockett was not the type to be baited. But still, there was this ripple. A sudden gust of electricity through the air, invisible but undeniable, like someone had just dared lightning to strike. Phones lit up instantly. Fingers moved fast. Hashtags sparked like wildfire. Reporters half rose from their seats, as if standing would bring the story closer. Social media didn't wait for the outcome it had already crowned, the moment a spectacle. IQ test was trending before Jasmine even looked up, before she even breathed. And yet, she didn't react. Not with her mouth, not with her face, not even with her eyes. That's what made it terrifying. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't laugh, didn't lean forward with a rebuttal or a challenge of her own. She didn't even flinch. She simply moved her hand smooth, slow, deliberate, and slid the envelope 1 inch forward. Just enough. Just far enough for everyone in the room to notice that it wasn't going to stay closed much longer. And in that exact second, the sound it made barely audible was somehow louder than Trump's voice had been a moment before. It didn't thud. It landed. Like a verdict. Like a thunderclap in slow motion. Not because it was loud, but because everyone knew what it meant. That envelope wasn't a prop. It was a trap. Not one built in anger, but in patience. And Jasmine had just shown the first thread. Trump didn't even see it happen. He was too busy smiling at the cameras, too drunk on his own performance. But others saw. The aides, the members of the committee, even the ones who'd been smirking just moments before they saw the shift. The mood changed. The game changed. And the man who thought he was holding all the cards? He had no idea. He just triggered the one move that couldn't be taken back. Because what Jasmine had just done wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was worse for him. It was calculated. She wasn't going to shout over him. She was going to bury him slowly, methodically with facts wrapped in paper, and she was going to make him watch it happen. 1 inch. That's all it took. And suddenly, everyone in the room realized the IQ test had already begun, and he'd already failed. Trump didn't even notice. He was too busy smiling, too busy soaking in the sound of his own voice and the imagined applause he thought was following every word. His grin was the kind that doesn't belong in a hearing room. It belonged on a man who thought he was still at a rally, with crowds chanting his name, with every insult landing like a punchline instead of an indictment. He leaned back in his chair like a king returning to his throne after delivering what he believed was the finishing blow. He thought Jasmine Crockett had gone quiet because he'd won, because she had nothing, because his words had cornered her into submission. But Jasmine wasn't cornered. She wasn't silent because she was out of moves. She was silent because she wasn't ready to move yet. He mistook her quiet for defeat, the way men like him always do. Because in his world, stillness means surrender. In hers, it means calculation. He thought she was folding, but she wasn't folding. She was framing. She was letting the edges settle, letting him dig deeper, talk louder, wrap himself tighter in his own rope. Every word he spoke, every insult he added to the pile, every cocky grin he gave the camera was letting him shape the frame he'd hang himself in. He didn't know it, but he was already inside the story she was about to tell. Not as the winner, but as the subject. Not as the architect, but as the artifact. Her stillness wasn't hesitation. It was structure. She was building something around him while he posed for a picture he thought he was controlling. He assumed the cameras were on him. They were, but not for the reasons he believed. They were recording the moment before everything snapped. He was busy winning a moment. She was preparing to own the entire narrative. He thought he was beating her at a game, but Jasmine wasn't playing. She was documenting. And the second she opened that envelope, it would no longer be his courtroom, his show, his spin. It would be evidence. And he would be in it. Not as a speaker, but as the exhibit. The chairman cleared his throat. Not because he needed to, but because the room did. The air had been holding its breath since the envelope moved, since the insult landed, since Jasmine hadn't blinked. His voice was soft but carried like a gavel. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have the floor." And that was it. Jasmine stood not fast, not hesitant, but like time itself had stepped aside to make room for her. No rustle of paper, no shuffling of notes. She didn't grab anything. She didn't check her watch. She didn't adjust her mic. She just stood. Like gravity in the room had realigned around her. Like the floor wasn't just holding her up, it was rising to meet her. People didn't just look at her. They felt her. That kind of quiet weight that doesn't shout for attention because it already owns the room before it speaks. She walked toward the microphone with the rhythm of someone who knew she wasn't stepping into a debate, he was stepping into truth. And the moment was catching up to her. She wasn't dramatic. No fire in her stride. No fury in her breath. Just presence. A calm, carved presence. The kind that tells you she's not walking up there to answer. She's walking up there to end it. There was no folder in her hands, no stack of papers. Nothing to hold except the years of being underestimated, spoken over, laughed at, tested, challenged. She didn't need a binder to prove her intelligence. She was the proof. Every eye tracked her. Even the ones that didn't want to. Even the ones that had been mocking her 5 minutes ago. Even the ones who had called her too loud, too bold, too black. Now they weren't saying a word. Because this wasn't noise walking to the mic. This was a shift. Even the room, the wood panels, the marble floor, the flags, the lights, they felt like they paused to watch. As if the architecture itself knew what was coming. As if the walls had seen hearings before, but not like this one. Not with someone who didn't need the spotlight because the truth she carried created its own. She reached the mic. No clearing of the throat. No testing the volume. She leaned in like someone who didn't need permission, just precision. And in that silence, right before she opened her mouth, something unspoken settled over everyone watching. She wasn't stepping up to be heard. She was stepping up to be remembered. "Mr. Trump," she said, and her voice didn't cut through the room, it lowered it. It didn't have to rise, because the moment was already hers. She didn't ask. She stated, calm, composed, deadly. "You've made public claims about your academic record. You've cited IQ tests, your college achievements." And for a split second, Trump froze, not because he was nervous, but because he thought this was the setup for another spotlight. Another opening for his favorite game, self-praise. And right on cue, his grin widened, like he'd just been handed a microphone at one of his old rallies. His body shifted forward, just slightly, like a performer stepping back into a role he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. "Damn right," he said, loud enough for the cameras. "Best scores, top of my class, no one like me." He didn't just say "I" performed it, grinning for the back row, flashing that polished arrogance like it was still 2016 and the world hadn't seen behind the curtain yet. Like swagger could still silence suspicion. He sounded like a man who'd told the same story so many times, he'd forgotten it was a lie. And worse, he believed it now. He leaned into the lie the way people lean into applause. He wanted to bask in it, wanted the room to nod along like it always used to. And for a moment, you could almost see it, the invisible crowd he carried in his mind, the echo chamber he lived inside, clapping for a man who built a reputation not on truth, but confidence. But Jasmine wasn't clapping. She wasn't nodding. She wasn't even blinking. She just stood there watching, letting him spin the rope longer, letting him lace the bravado tighter, because every syllable he added to his fantasy wasn't reinforcing it, it was exposing it. To everyone in the room, to everyone watching, and most damning of all, to himself. He thought her calm was a cue for him to speak louder, thought her stillness was surrender. But he didn't realize that in Jasmine Crockett's courtroom, the loudest person isn't the one with the mic. It's the one holding receipts. And she was about to open them, not to argue, to correct the record. Jasmine nodded. Not fast, not dramatic, just slowly, like someone who had already known what she would say, long before this moment even existed. It wasn't the nod of agreement. It wasn't the nod of confrontation. It was the nod of inevitability. A nod that said, "You wrote this script, Mr. Courting. Trump, I'm just here to read it back to you, line by line, in front of the country you lied to." Then, with a grace that felt too deliberate to be casual and too calm to be unprepared, her hand lifted. No rush, no theater, just quiet, surgical movement. Her fingers slipped beneath the envelope, the same one she had tapped once earlier like a warning, and this time she brought it into the light. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she tapped it gently on the desk. Once. Not for attention. For emphasis. It was the sound of confidence, not anger. The sound of control, not reaction. That one tap traveled through the room like thunder muffled in a courtroom, like the faint echo of a storm that hadn't arrived yet but was already darkening the sky. And then she spoke. "This envelope contains material related to your standardized test history." She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. Every word landed like a signature being pressed onto stone, including sworn statements, verified records, and a name. She let the sentence sit, let it stretch, let it breathe. She didn't fill the silence that followed, framed it. The kind of pause that makes people look at each other, not because they're confused, but because they feel what's coming, and they're already bracing for impact. Trump's grin so wide a moment ago, so smug it had its own gravitational pull twitched. Just barely. But it was enough. A flicker. A break. Like the mask had slipped for half a second and revealed what lay underneath. Not certainty, not control, but recognition. Because he knew. Not the details. Not yet. But the tone. He'd heard that tone before. In depositions. In closed-door interviews. In moments where facts couldn't be spun and the lawyers stopped smiling. The sound of someone who wasn't bluffing. The sound of a clock running out. The sound of something real. And in that twitch of a smile, that half-second crack in the facade, it became clear. He didn't know what was in the envelope, but he knew it wasn't nothing. And that scared him more than anything Jasmine had said. She didn't gloat. That would have been too easy. She didn't smirk, didn't let even a flicker of satisfaction show on her face, because this wasn't about winning. It wasn't about applause or headlines or revenge. Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to score points. She was here to reveal something, something heavy, something old, something hidden so long that when it finally came out, it wouldn't need an introduction. It would walk in on its own. Quiet, inevitable. She didn't raise her voice. In fact, she lowered it slightly. Not to be dramatic, but to make the room lean in. Because when someone doesn't shout what they're saying, it means they believe you're smart enough to feel its weight without volume. And Jasmine knew her words weren't just information. They were impact. They didn't need to explode to cause a rupture. They just needed to be heard. She held the envelope with the same ease. Someone might hold a glass of water before a wildfire like. It was nothing to look at, but everything to feel. Then, looking straight ahead past the cameras, past the smirks, past the bravado still clinging to the other side of the room, she spoke with composure so sharp it cut through the stillness like a razor through silk. "I'm submitting these materials into the official record, Mr. Chairman." That was it. No accusations, no speeches, just a sentence. Clean, surgical, final. But what followed wasn't a reaction. It was a rippling. The kind of gasp that moves through a courtroom like an invisible wave. It didn't come from volume. It came from timing. From realization. Because everyone in that room, even the ones who'd convinced themselves she had nothing, even the ones who had rolled their eyes when she walked to the mic, felt it in their chest. This wasn't political theater anymore. This was documentation. This was evidence. This was a receipt being added to history. And the gasp wasn't just about what was in the envelope. It was about when she chose to drop it. Right after Trump dared her. Right after he smirked his way into his own undoing. Right after he invited the world to measure intelligence by a test he never took. She didn't slap him with it. She filed it. And somehow, that was louder than any scream could have been. And then, without a flourish, without a warning, she played the clip. The screen behind her lit up, sudden and cold, like a light turned on in a room where secrets had been sleeping too long. No preamble, no dramatic countdown. Just a simple click, and then silence as the footage began to roll. And in that silence, the entire room shifted. Chairs creaked. Breath caught. Phones froze mid-record. Because no one expected that. There, on the monitor, was a man. Not young, not polished. Frail. In fact, maybe in his 80s. Lying in a hospital bed that looked as worn as the truth he was about to unearth. Tubes at his arms, skin thin. But his eyes were steady, clear, sober. This wasn't a man playing politics. This was a man with one final thing to say before he ran out of time. He looked into the lens not with anger, not with sadness, but with the kind of quiet burden that only lives in people who've carried a truth longer than anyone should. And then, with no hesitation, no need to be prompted, he spoke. "My name is Robert Steedman." The room leaned forward. Even the skeptics. Even the staffers who had been half listening moments ago. In 1964, I was paid 1-0 by Fred Trump to take the SATs for his son, Donald. The sentence didn't equate landed. Hard, heavy, unapologetic. It didn't just fill the room, it reset it. No one moved. No one coughed. No one tweeted. Because that wasn't a headline. That wasn't a tweet. That was a bomb dropped softly, gently, by a dying man who had nothing left to gain and everything to unload. A man whose voice cracked just slightly at the edges, not because he doubted what he was saying, but because he remembered. The hallway, the handshake, the envelope full of cash, the silent agreement. The moment he signed someone else's name and walked out of a school knowing the weight of that lie would last far longer than the test ever would. Trump blinked. Once. His lips parted slightly not to speak, but as if the oxygen had changed, and his lungs didn't know what to do with it. The smile was gone. Not wiped off. Not shattered. Just missing. Like it had slipped out the back door while no one was looking. And Jasmine? She didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. She already knew what it said. Because this wasn't just evidence. It was a confession. A name. A number. A year. A man. The truth had finally found a face. And the lie, after all this time, had finally met its witness. The room didn't just freeze, it locked, as if time itself had stepped back and slammed the door behind it. Chairs that had been shifting moments before went still, stiff like statues. No one dared to adjust their seat. Even the smallest sounds, the clink of a cufflink, the hum of a phone, vanished like they were swallowed by the weight now hanging in the air. Pens, which had been scribbling on notepads for sound bites and summaries, stopped mid-word. One aide held their pen so tightly, the tip snapped. But no one looked. No one noticed. Every eye was forward. Every breath was measured. It wasn't just silence. It was paralysis. The kind of silence that doesn't happen in rooms like this, rooms built for shouting, for grandstanding, for performative outrage. This was the silence that only shows up when the walls of power realize they can't hold the truth back anymore. Not with position, not with noise, not even with fear. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who'd been smirking minutes ago, now stared down at her notes like they were written in a language she'd never seen. Jim Jordan shifted once, then twice, like a man trying to disappear into his own seat. Even Eric Trump, who had been glowing with secondhand confidence earlier, now sat like someone who had heard a ghost speak his father's name. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine, still, unshaken, watching the ripple without needing to control it. She didn't smile, didn't blink. She didn't need to, because the truth didn't need her permission to work. It had already entered the bloodstream of the room, infecting every denial, every practiced line, every face that once looked certain but now looked lost. They weren't just witnessing a revelation. They were feeling the collapse. The structure they had all stood on, the illusion, the myth, the performance of intelligence and invincibility had cracked. And in that pause, in that unbearable, uncontrollable stillness, they realized this wasn't just a moment. This was a turning point. And none of them had a script for what came next. Trump slammed the desk, not with the force of confidence, but with the desperation of a man trying to wake himself up from a nightmare he couldn't control. Lies. Fake. That man's a nobody. His voice cracked not from volume, but from fear. It shot out like a jagged weapon, aimed at anything that could shift the narrative, pull the spotlight back to him, make the ground stop crumbling beneath his feet. He looked around, wild-eyed, not just at Jasmine, but at the chairman, the staffers, the press, at the cameras, as if they might still be on his side, as if saying it loud enough, saying it angrily enough, would rewrite the facts already etched in the room's memory. But the illusion was bleeding out in front of him, and everyone could smell it. He wasn't rebutting, he was pleading. He was begging the air to catch his words and give them back the power they once held. But it was gone. The magic trick didn't work anymore. The cards were on the table. The rabbit was dead. And the audience wasn't clapping. They weren't even blinking. And Jasmine? She didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't even breathe heavier. She stood like a mountain watching a storm throw itself against the rocks. Like she'd seen this before. In different rooms. With different men. Men who screamed when silence exposed them. Men who shouted fake when facts were too real. Men who broke things when they couldn't bend them anymore. Trump's hand hovered over the desk like he might slam it again. Like maybe, just maybe, the second hit would undo the damage of the first. But it didn't. It couldn't. The rage didn't echo this time. It landed flat, like a tantrum in a room full of grown-ups. And even he knew it. Because Jasmine wasn't reacting to the sound. She was listening to what the silence underneath it revealed. And in that silence, everyone heard the same thing. He didn't have a defense. He only had volume. She placed the second document beside her with the precision of a surgeon, not a politician. No drama, no grand gesture, just paper meeting wood, soft, certain, and final. It didn't flutter. It didn't slide. It landed, like a piece of history returning to its rightful place. And in that small motion, the room shifted again. Tension tightened. Attention narrowed. The second document wasn't just backup, it was the weight behind the blade. Her voice followed, steady and sharp, carrying none of Trump's chaos, none of his flailing noise. It was calm, but not soft, like steel cooled and tempered over fire. That man, she said, each word slow and deliberate, was verified by 2 federal investigators. The air cracked like ice beneath her words. Not because people didn't believe her, but because they suddenly did. Confirmed by handwriting analysts. No one looked at Trump now. They didn't need to. His expression was enough. A man watching the room rotate around him, powerless to stop it. His mouth twitched open, but nothing came out. Not yet. His chest rose faster than before. His hands clenched the table, not in strength, in survival. And he has no public political affiliations. She didn't say it like a defense. She said it like a burial. No bias. No motive. No angle. Just a man, dying with a truth too heavy to carry to the grave. And then came the blade. Quiet. Clean. He passed your test. She let that hang. Let the weight of irony choke the arrogance right out of the room. The very challenge Trump had thrown into the air, weaponized with smug laughter, had been met not by him, but by the man he'd paid to wear his name. And he kept the receipt. The line didn't need to be shouted. It didn't need to be repeated. It was the kind of line that rewrote the temperature of the room. No longer warm with performance. Now cold. Clinical. Real. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at Trump. She looked down at the document like it was a stone laid at the end of a long road. Not a threat. Not a warning. A record. And records don't argue. They wait. Even the chairman leaned back, not out of exhaustion, but like something unseen had just moved through the room and brushed past his spine. His fingers, which had been casually steepled for most of the hearing, slowly unclasped. He looked toward Jasmine, not as a moderator of discussion, but as a man watching history rewire itself right in front of him. You could see it in his face. The moment he realized this wasn't just another session. This wasn't political theater. This was a reckoning. The room wasn't moving anymore. It was listening. Not because it had been told to, but because it had to. There was nowhere else to go. No air left to fill with arguments. No script left to flip back to. The hearing had stopped being about legislation or commentary the second Jasmine placed those documents on the table. Now it was something else entirely. A confession chamber with no priest. Only truth. And outside that room, behind a row of cameras and control boards, even the Fox News producer strained to spin, to cut, to pivot sat, frozen, eyes wide, hands hovering over buttons they didn't press. There were no cuts, no interruptions, no whispered cues to break for commercial. Because even they knew, you don't cut away from a fall this big. Not when it's real. Not when it's unfolding live. One producer, seasoned and cynical, mouthed, "Oh my God," without even realizing he'd said it. Another lowered her headset just for a moment, as if needing silence to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. They had aired 1,000 outbursts before, but this wasn't noise. This was evidence swallowing a narrative whole. The broadcast delay they usually used like a shield gone. The chatter in the control room gone. The talking points in their inbox gone. Because the camera wasn't capturing drama anymore. It was capturing defeat. And no one blinked. Not the staffers, not the anchors, not even the audience at home. Because when truth walks in with receipts, even the loudest machines go quiet. But Jasmine wasn't finished. The room hadn't even begun to process the weight of what had already been laid bare, and yet she moved again slowly, like a tide refusing to retreat. Her hand, still calm, still precise, slipped into the folder once more. There was no rush, no need for theatrics. She wasn't feeding the moment, she was deepening it. The kind of deep that makes people lean in without realizing they're holding their breath. The kind that says, "You thought the story ended here?" She pulled out a second letter, worn at the edges like it had lived in someone's drawer for decades, folded neatly, preserved, not protected. Not dramatic in appearance, but the kind of paper that carries more weight than a gavel. She unfolded it in front of the mic like a ceremony, no frills, just truth being brought into daylight. And then, with a voice like still water finding its edge, she read, "A rejection notice," she began, and the words already landed like stones. Addressed to Elliot Harmon, Black, 17, valedictorian. The names weren't just facts, they were footprints, of someone who walked the path the right way, of someone who played by the rules while another man bought the ending. Applied to Wharton the same year Trump faked his way in. And there it was. Not just corruption, displacement. Not just lies, stolen futures. The gasp in the room this time wasn't dramatic, it was personal. For the staffers who looked like Elliot, for the interns who had lived his story in different zip codes, for the parents watching at home who saw their sons and daughters in the name on that letter. It wasn't just about Trump anymore. It was about every Elliot Harmon who ever got a door slammed shut while someone like Trump climbed in through the side window with a check. The room didn't just hurt, It ached. And Jasmine didn't drive the knife. She just revealed it, still in the wound, still fresh after all these years. There was no applause. There was no rebuttal. Just a silence that tasted like guilt, and a truth that came too late for Elliot, but maybe not too late for the rest of the country to finally see what had always been there, sealed in someone else's envelope. She read it aloud. Not with fire, not with rage, but with the quiet reverence of someone unearthing a buried name on a headstone. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't waver. It carried low, steady, undeniable. Every syllable was a brick, laid down not just for Elliot Harmon, but for every brilliant kid who ever got told no for a reason that had nothing to do with merit. "We regret to inform you," she began, and the words sat heavy in the air, too familiar to too many. A simple phrase, one the world had heard a million times. But coming from her mouth, right here, right now after the fake scores, after the paid test taker, after the exposed leet felt different, it wasn't just a rejection letter anymore. It was an indictment. And then she paused, folded the page back slightly to read the handwritten note scrawled at the bottom in blue ink faded, but still legible. A quick sentence added by someone who hadn't expected the letter to survive this long. Someone who thought their quiet prejudice would die in the margins. But it didn't. Too many quotas filled. Too risky. She didn't shout it, didn't punch it like a line in a speech. She just let it fall. And when it landed, it didn't echo, it stung. Because that wasn't policy. That wasn't data. That was bias. Scratched casually by someone who decided, on a whim, that brilliance in black skin was a liability. That a valedictorian named Elliot wasn't worth the paperwork. That some doors were meant to stay locked, no matter how golden the key. The room shifted again, not with gasps this time, but with shame. The kind of shame that doesn't get spoken. The kind that tightens your throat and makes you look down at your shoes. Because it wasn't just Trump on trial anymore. It was the system that let him in and pushed Elliot out. And Jasmine, standing there, wasn't just holding a letter. She was holding a mirror. The pain didn't come from Trump anymore. It wasn't in his scowl or his sputtering denial. It had moved beyond him, seeped past his desk, past his name, past his arrogance. The room no longer centered around him. He had become a side note to something much heavier, something deeper, something that had been waiting, decades long, to be spoken aloud. The pain came from the silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of shock, but the silence of recognition. The kind that settles into a room when everyone finally realizes the story wasn't just about one man cheating a system, it was about the system itself, cheating everyone else. You could feel it in the way backs straightened and eyes looked away. You could feel it in the stillness of people who had spent years ignoring stories like Elliot's, dismissing them as exaggerations or excuses, and were now being forced to read them in plain font, under the glare of a congressional microphone. This wasn't just a document. It was a timestamp, a piece of truth that had waited 40 years to speak, and now that it had, no one could pretend they didn't hear it. The pain came from that ink, from those 7 words scrawled at the bottom of a rejection. Too many quotas filled. Too risky. The pain came from knowing Elliot Harmon probably folded that letter 3 times and hid it in a drawer, like so many others had. That he probably told his mother it was okay, even though it wasn't. That he watched another name, a richer name, a paler name, walk into the future he earned but never received. The pain came from the truth finally being printed, finally being spoken, and knowing it hadn't arrived in time to save him. And no one could stop it now. Not with a gavel, not with spin, not even with power. Because when a room goes that quiet, it means something ancient just stood up. And everyone is finally looking at it. She reached for one last item, a phone, screen dim, volume already cued. No theatrics, no warning. Just a thumb press. And then came the voice. It wasn't polished. It wasn't prepped for TV. It didn't belong to a politician or a pundit. It cracked the moment it hit the speakers, raw, human, real. A voicemail. A woman. Young. Shaking. Trying to hold herself together. Trying not to cry. And failing. He never knew he was good enough. The words came out like glass through skin. Not because she couldn't say them, but because she'd been holding them in for years. Her voice trembled. Not for effect. Not for sympathy. Just because grief has no script, and pain doesn't care about tone. You could hear it the way she stumbled over he, the way she clutched the memory of a father who died, carrying a burden he didn't deserve. He thought he failed. A pause. Heavy. Like she couldn't believe she was saying it out loud, even now. The kind of pause that makes a room forget to breathe. That makes eyes drop to the floor and fists tighten in helplessness. But he never even had a chance. And there it was. Not an accusation. Not a headline. Just the truth buried in someone's voicemail, delivered between sobs, spoken for the first time to the very world that denied it. The room wasn't just silent anymore. It was haunted. Because now Elliot Harmon had a voice. Not a statistic. Not a letter. A daughter. A living witness to everything he never got to say. Everything he never got to confront. Her pain wasn't political. It wasn't scripted. It was the echo of injustice finally filling the chamber built to ignore it. And Jasmine didn't interrupt. Didn't speak over her. She just let the voicemail play until the last tearful breath faded into silence. The kind of silence that hurts. Because now everyone in the room knew exactly what it cost for that story to survive. There were no questions after that. Just eyes filled with something too heavy to name. Trump sat back, stone-faced. But not the kind of stone that looks strong, the kind that looks stuck, frozen. Like whatever had been fueling him, the defiance, the smirks, the swagger had suddenly run out, and now he was just a man in a chair with nothing left to say. His eyes didn't scan the room like they used to. They stayed fixed on a spot in the distance. Nowhere in particular, just far enough to avoid meeting anyone else's. His jaw was tight, locked with pressure that had nowhere to go. And under the desk, where the cameras couldn't see, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles went pale. You could almost hear it skin against skin, the grind of frustration and panic boiling beneath the surface. Not because of what was said, but because of what couldn't be undone. This wasn't like before. He couldn't tweet his way out, couldn't shout it down, couldn't point a finger and say, "Fake news," and move the crowd with volume. The crowd wasn't moving. The cameras were still rolling. And now, even the people who used to nod along weren't meeting his eyes. He looked like a man who had finally realized the story wasn't his anymore. Because in this room, on this day, someone else had taken the floor, and they didn't need volume to win. They had truth. They had paper. They had a name, a daughter's voice, a dead man's record, and a silence so loud it made every denial feel hollow. Stone-faced? Maybe. But stone cracks too. And Trump knew, deep in the grip of his fists, that this wasn't a headline he could spin. This was the part of the story where the spotlight stopped being his and started revealing everything he wanted buried. And Jasmine? She didn't point, didn't lean forward, didn't throw a single finger toward the man now shrinking behind a desk he once treated like a throne. There was no need to shout, no need to rise above the silence. She stood still, centered, like gravity belonged to her. And then, without shifting her body, without flinching, she turned her gaze straight into the camera. Not just into the lens, but through it. Past the committee, past the reporters, past the marble walls, past every filter and frame the world likes to hide behind. She was looking into living rooms, into schools, into barbershops, corner stores, courtrooms, crowded apartments, into every place that had ever heard that laugh, the smug, slow laugh of someone who thinks they'll never be caught. Her voice didn't rise. It carried. You laughed at my IQ. The words weren't defensive. They weren't bitter. They were surgical, clean, aimed not at his insult but at the centuries behind it. The weight of every time a woman of color had to swallow her brilliance because someone louder felt smaller in its shadow. The insult was never just a moment. It was a message, a warning, a weapon. And she held it in her hand like glass and didn't bleed. But the test you passed. She paused, just long enough for the shame to breathe. Was never yours. The truth didn't need footnotes now. The room had already seen the envelope, heard the voicemail, read the rejection. It knew. And now she was saying it, finally, out loud, in the plainest language possible for every Elliot who never got to. And the one who failed? Another pause. Heavier this time. Not for drama, for memory. She closed her eyes just for a breath and opened them. Never even got to take it. That was it. No yell, no slogan. Just the truth, cracked open and left in the light. And in that moment, it didn't matter who was in the room. Because she wasn't speaking to Trump anymore. She was speaking to all of us. A beat. Not just a pause in sound, a pause in history. The kind of beat that isn't empty, but full, heavy, holy. A sacred stillness where no one dares to move because they know something just shifted. A page just turned, not in a book, but in the country. In all its noise, all its spinning, all its shouting, this was the moment that cut through. That one beat, where every eye was on her, but every heart was somewhere else back with Elliot, with his unopened acceptance letter that never came, with his daughter gripping a phone full of tears, with every unheard voice, every quiet injustice that never got a microphone. That beat carried all of it. Trump didn't move. He couldn't. The room wouldn't allow it. The chairman didn't speak. No gavel. No, thank you, Congresswoman. Because what do you say after that? The aides didn't shuffle papers. Reporters didn't type. Even the cameras, though rolling, felt like they were bowing their heads. It was the kind of beat that lives longer than sound. The kind that rewrites reputations. That seals legacy. That turns a hearing into a reckoning, and a congresswoman into a conscience. And Jasmine? She stood in the middle of it, like she knew this was the beat everyone would remember. Not the insult, not the slam, not the smirk, but this. The moment the truth stood taller than power, and the whole world just listened. Then, without fanfare, she pulled out the final file. No drum roll, no build-up, just movement deliberate, unshaken, like the last note of a song that had already struck the chord nobody could forget. Her hand reached into the folder one last time, and when it came back up, the room knew, even before they saw it, that this was the end. Not the end of a hearing, not the end of a session, but the end of pretending. The file wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. The truth rarely comes with a stack of pages, just the right ones, the necessary ones, the damning ones. Her fingers didn't tremble. Not from nerves, not from adrenaline. They moved like someone who had held this weight before and knew exactly where to place it. And when she set that file on the table, she didn't say a word. Because she didn't have to. The energy shifted again. You could feel it in the way the air pulled tighter, like a balloon stretched to its final breath. You could see it in the way people leaned forward without meaning to, drawn not by curiosity but by gravity. The kind of gravity that only shows up when justice steps into the room. Trump's lips parted slightly, just enough to breathe, or to brace. No one could tell. His shoulders tensed like a man trying to stop the tide with his back turned to the ocean. He knew. Everyone knew. This wasn't just another blow. This was the one that sealed the story. The one that wrote the headline in permanent ink. And Jasmine? Still didn't gloat. Still didn't blink. She rested her hand on the folder with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed revenge, only truth. Then she spoke. Not to him, not even to the room, but to history. This file contains the application Elliot Harmon would have submitted to Princeton the following year, had he believed he was worthy. A silence hit that didn't just mute, it hollowed the room. Because now it wasn't about proving a lie. It was about what the lie had stolen. No rebuttal could fix that. No apology could return that year. No money could buy that dream back. The final file wasn't evidence. It was a memorial. And in placing it on the record, Jasmine didn't just close a chapter, she buried the myth. Right there, under the weight of a truth that had waited far too long. It looked official. Embossed header, sharp edges, stapled perfectly, like something pulled from a clean file drawer in a private office, not a courtroom. A transcript, neatly printed, clear. Intimidating to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The kind of document Trump had waved for years like a trophy. Proof, he claimed, of his genius, of his top marks, of his place among the elite. But Jasmine turned it over slowly, carefully, not like someone unmasking a lie, but like someone exposing a forgery, long known, long whispered, now finally lit under fluorescent truth. She laid it flat. This is the document Mr. Trump has proudly referenced in multiple interviews, public statements, and even campaign rallies, she said. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It didn't need to be. The weight was in the details. She pointed to the first red flag. A course title, Advanced International Business Strategy 4. She paused. Let the audience soak it in. This course did not exist at the institution during the semester listed. Then the registrar's name, Clara W. McDermott. The committee watched. The registrar at the time was Clarice McDermott. 2 C's. No W. A beat. Small, but surgical. Precise. Then she tapped the transcript's corner gently, almost kindly like she was giving the paper a final goodbye. "And this?" she said, tapping the text beneath Trump's supposed final GPA. This specific font style was not created until 1989. The transcript claimed it was printed in 1968. You could feel the air leave the room, one lung at a time. Not because the lie was shocking, but because it was so lazy, so arrogantly careless. A lie told so often, so loudly, that no one had ever stopped to ask the simplest question: does this even make sense? And now, under Jasmine's quiet dismantling, it didn't just unravel, it collapsed. Word by word, line by line, stroke by stroke. This wasn't just a fake. It was a fantasy dressed up in official language and held up by sheer confidence and years of unchecked privilege. And Jasmine, with a voice low and surgical, had walked the room through every stitch of the costume until all that was left was the naked truth. And it wasn't brilliant. It wasn't elite. It was forged. And finally finished. An Ivy League lie, held together by ego and ink. A fantasy stitched with arrogance, wrapped in entitlement, and waved around like a crown by a man who built his identity not on achievement, but on the assumption that no one would ever dare check the fine print. And for years, no one did. Not because they believed it, but because they didn't think it mattered. Because when you shout loud enough, long enough, people stop asking questions. They just nod. They move on. They forget that paper can be faked, that prestige can be bought, that doors don't always swing open for the smartest, sometimes they creak for the richest. But now the lie sat there, naked under the lights, exposed for what it had always been, a fragile performance with no stage left to stand on. And it wasn't the boldness of the forgery that stunned the room, it was the sloppiness. A font too modern, a course that never existed, a name slightly misspelled. These weren't just mistakes. They were confessions, written right into the body of the lie, the kind of details a man never expects anyone to notice, because he spent his life in rooms where no one bothers to read past the title. And yet here it was, being read aloud, examined, dissected, not by a scandal-hungry journalist or a political rival, but by a woman he once laughed at publicly, cruelly, as low IQ. A woman he assumed was too small to reach him, too insignificant to threaten the tower he'd built out of paper and bluster. But Jasmine wasn't reaching. She was revealing, not just his lie, but the lie of every room that ever nodded when he bragged, every anchor who repeated it, every biography that printed it without a second glance, every system that let a man walk into Wharton, walk into real estate, walk into the White House, all without ever really being asked to prove anything. Because this wasn't just about a transcript. It was about trust. And what happens when someone finally pulls the thread from a lie so big, so central, that you realize it wasn't a crown he wore, it was a costume. And the real man beneath it wasn't genius, wasn't elite, wasn't even qualified. He was just loud. And the louder he got, the more fragile it became. Until Jasmine Crockett, armed with nothing but receipts and restraint, turned down the volume, and the truth rang louder than he ever did. Then Jasmine stepped acid to naught with a flourish, not with a victory grin, but with the calm certainty of someone who had done what needed to be done. And in her place rose a man who looked like he belonged in a laboratory, not a courtroom. Dr. Aaron Bernaire. White hair, slate gray suit, a voice that didn't rise above conversation level but somehow still silenced the entire room. He adjusted his glasses, set down a thick binder, and tapped the table like a surgeon about to begin. No preamble, no small talk. "This is a forgery," he said, his tone flat as marble. "Undeniably, mathematically, historically." 3 words, each colder than the last. Mathematically, because the GPA Trump claimed was a statistical impossibility based on the grading curve at the time. It didn't just stretch logic, it shattered it. No one in his program scored that high. Not even the professors who designed the exams. Historically, because the course codes listed didn't exist until years later. Entire departments hadn't even been founded. He named them one by one. You could hear chairs shift uncomfortably with every correction. And undeniably because forensic typography doesn't lie. And what Dr. Bernaire had done was simple. He ran the transcript through a font recognition database, cross-referenced with university print logs, cataloged print machines, and national typeface registries. Yes, such a thing exists. And yes, the font used in Trump's so-called transcript wasn't manufactured until over 2 decades after he claimed to have graduated. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't need to be. His evidence wasn't loud, it was lethal. And with every word, he dismantled the myth, not like a rival, but like a scientist disassembling a broken machine. No passion, no rage, just truth, sharpened into fact. And when he was done, he didn't even look at Trump. He simply closed the binder, took a sip of water, and sat down. That was it. Nothing left to prove, nothing more to say. And in the quiet that followed, you could feel it. That wasn't a rebuttal. That was a diagnosis. And the disease wasn't just the document. It was the delusion that it would never be questioned, that a lie repeated loud enough, long enough, becomes unbreakable. But lies don't survive microscopes. And Jasmine brought a man who didn't blink behind one. And then came the question. Not a speech, not a grandstanding line, just a sentence sharp, quiet, and honed like it had been waiting in her chest for years. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward or flare with emotion. She sat still, spine straight, eyes locked, and asked it the way a surgeon presses a scalpel into skin. Sir, is lying about your IQ more dangerous than lying about nuclear codes? The words didn't explode. They cut. They didn't seek a reaction. They unveiled one. Trump blinked. That was all, just one blink. But it was enough, because for the first time all day, the room didn't look at Jasmine for the answer. It looked at him. And there was none. No quip. No joke. No fake news. The man who had bragged about cognitive tests on national television, who had called himself a stable genius, who had mocked generals, scientists, professors, he had nothing. Because that question wasn't about intelligence. It was about trust, about power, about what happens when a man who fakes grades is handed missiles, about the kind of mind that thinks a cheat sheet qualifies you to lead a nation. And the silence after was nuclear in its own way. A kind of silence you feel in your ribs. The silence of everyone in the room calculating the distance between a fake transcript and a launch code. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smirk. She just waited and let the weight of her question fall like lead into the air. Because this wasn't about a score anymore. This was about what kind of man needs to lie to be respected, and what kind of nation is willing to believe him. Trump didn't answer. Not because he chose silence, but because silence was all he had left. Words, his favorite weapon, had finally abandoned him. The man who could talk his way out of lawsuits, bankruptcies, marriages, elections, sat still, cornered not by anger, not by outrage, but by truth. And the truth didn't raise its voice. It didn't throw punches. It just stood in front of him, unblinking, undeniable, and asked a question with no safe exit. Because there wasn't one. There was no version of that answer that didn't lead somewhere darker. Admit the lie, and the mask slips the genius undone, the myth exposed. Deny it, and the evidence remains. Documents, audio, experts, a daughter's tears, a transcript that aged worse than his excuses. He looked out at the committee, searching for a lifeline, a smirk from Jordan, a glare from Green, a shake of the head, anything. But they were no longer with him. Their loyalty had limits. No one wanted to catch the fall of a man collapsing under facts. And maybe, just maybe, for a flicker of a second he realized it. That all this time, it wasn't charisma holding him up. It wasn't bravado. It was permission. Permission from rooms that never ask questions. From people who never look too close. From a country that sometimes confuses noise with worth. But Jasmine had removed the noise. And what stood in the silence wasn't power. It was a man. A man who had lied too often, reached too far, and now sat shrinking behind a desk that no longer protected him. He didn't answer. Because truth doesn't negotiate. And in that moment, with cameras rolling, minds turning, history writing itself in real-time silence was his confession. And finally, Jasmine said the words that didn't just echo, they etched themselves into the walls, into the record, into every living room and replay and headline that would follow. The words that weren't meant for applause or retweets, but for permanence. The kind of words that cut through generations of noise and rewrote where the power sat in the room. She didn't raise her voice, didn't smile, didn't even blink when she said it. She just turned her head slightly, faced him one last time, not like a rival, but like someone who'd just finished burying a lie and dropped it. You told me to sit down, genius, but I wasn't standing for myself. The air in the chamber cracked, not with gasps, not with shouts, but with knowing. Because in that moment, every woman who had ever been told to calm down, every black voice that had been labeled angry when it was simply clear, every underdog dismissed for speaking too boldly, too early, too much stood. She wasn't just replying to Trump. She was speaking across time to every seat she'd ever earned, that someone tried to pretend she didn't deserve. She wasn't there to be liked. She wasn't there to be polite. She was there because someone had to be. And the genius she mentioned? It didn't belong to him anymore. It never had. It was the quiet brilliance of Elliot Harmon, of his daughter, of every name that got buried beneath someone else's privilege. It was the truth that takes its time and then shows up uninvited, unstoppable, and unafraid. Trump sat frozen. No defense, no slogan, no card left to play. Because those words didn't need backup. They were the period, the exhale, the closing line of a chapter that would be studied, quoted, remembered long after the cameras cut. Jasmine didn't look at the crowd. She didn't seek a reaction. She just sat back in her seat like someone who didn't need to stand anymore, because she'd already risen. She held up the Constitution not like a prop, not like a politician searching for applause, but like a promise. A worn, sacred promise that had been broken, bent, and rewritten by power for centuries, yet somehow still held just enough hope for someone like her to reach into its spine and pull out something real. She didn't wave it. She lifted it. Steady. Clear. As if to remind the room in the country that the paper they all swore by had pages soaked in the silence of people like Elliot and the courage of people like her. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened. It dropped into something older, something rooted, something that carried not just her story, but the weight of generations who had stood only to be told to sit right back down. I stood for every woman who's ever been told they were too loud, too much, too angry, too black. And she didn't flinch on the last word. Too black. Because they always whisper that part. They let it hang between the lines, in boardrooms, on ballots, behind closed doors. But Jasmine said it, spoke it clean, lit it on fire. And in doing so, she didn't just reclaim it, she weaponized it. Not as a threat, but as proof. Proof that survival is brilliance. That presence is protest. That showing up and not backing down is the most American thing you can do. Then she lowered the Constitution gently, almost reverently, but her words stayed standing. I didn't sit, because the truth doesn't sit. And in that moment, you could feel it truth, real truth, not the polished kind, but the blood and bone kind, standing in the room, not polite, not quiet, not asking for permission. Truth that wears heels and holds receipts. Truth that buries lies with documents and syllables. Truth that doesn't beg for a see at it, takes the floor and dares you to move it. Cameras captured the image, Jasmine Crockett, holding the Constitution in one hand and an entire history in the other. She wasn't asking for validation. She wasn't waiting to be thanked. She was reminding America of a truth it had tried to forget. That justice doesn't whisper. It doesn't wait. And it damn sure doesn't sit down when told to. And with one final breath measured, steady, like the last note of a requiem played not for mourning but for reckoning, Jasmine Crockett leaned into the mic, not to shout, not to declare victory, but to mark the moment, to etch it into record, into memory, into the bone-deep history of a country that forgets too quickly, who had to fight just to be heard. She didn't raise her eyes to the crowd. She didn't gesture. No theatrics, no applause chasing, just a lean, just a breath. And then she whispered it soft enough that the room had to lean in, but sharp enough that it cut clean through every layer of pretense. I yield my time. It echoed. The formal phrase, the procedural close, the expected curtain. But she wasn't done. Not really. Because as the last syllable of time faded into the walls, she let the next ones drop like iron. But I will never yield my worth. It didn't just land. It reverberated. Across the polished floors, across the pressed suits and stone faces, across every senator who'd once dismissed her as just another headline. across every intern who would replay this moment on their phone 100 times that night, wondering what it meant to show up fully, without apology. And on Trump, it fell like a judgment, because that line, that final quiet line, undid everything he'd tried to weaponize. Her race, her intelligence, her voice, her presence. He'd tried to shrink her, to belittle her, to make the world see her through his lens of superiority. But she shattered the lens, with a whisper. And in that whisper, she declared something bigger than herself. She spoke for every underestimated soul who ever had to bite their tongue to keep their job, their place, their life intact. For every kid told they were too much, every woman told to sit down, every truth buried under someone else's comfort. She yielded the mic. Not her dignity, not her fire, not her worth. And as she stepped back quiet, composed, unshaken, you could feel the shift. Not just in the room, in the story, in the country. Because that moment didn't need to be shouted to be remembered. It just needed to be true. The room didn't clap at first, because clapping felt too small, too easy, too hollow for what had just happened. Applause is for performances. This wasn't that. This wasn't a debate that could be scored, or a soundbite to be recycled. This was a reckoning, a long overdue collision between truth and the myth it had chased through generations. So instead of noise, the room gave her what it had denied her kind for so long: reverence. People stood, some slowly, like they didn't even realize their legs were moving. Others rose as if pulled by something ancient, something sacred. Not admiration recognition. Recognition of power that didn't ask for permission. Recognition of intelligence that had been ignored, mocked, underestimated, until it silenced the very room that once doubted it. And it was quiet. Not the silence of shock that had come earlier. This was the silence of understanding. Of people realizing they had just witnessed something unrepeatable. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't thrown a single insult. She hadn't needed to. Because when the truth walks in wearing grace and facts and restraint, it doesn't have to scream to be heard. It just is. And in that moment, everyone knew. The smartest voice in the room hadn't been the loudest, or the richest, or the most famous. It had been the most prepared, the most grounded, the one that had walked through a storm of disrespect and never once lost its footing. Jasmine didn't need their applause. She had their silence, their stillness, their stand. And in that stillness, something shifted not just in the air, but in the record, in the narrative, in the invisible ledger that history uses to balance what it gets wrong. And this time, finally, it got it right. She had spoken. The room had listened. And no matter how loud the world tried to get after that, it would never drown this out.